From a technological nuisance to a national security threat, hackers are increasingly stealing and blocking corporate data, then forcing companies to pay millions of dollars to get it back. How can it be stopped? And are cryptocurrencies making it easier to commit digital extortion? I'm Andrei Fedorov, and today's newsmaker is ransomware. In the United States, it's estimated that 6 companies an hour fall prey to a ransomware attack. It's become so common there are now firms who specialize in facilitating million-dollar ransom payments, and companies are buying up cryptocurrency to have on hand in case they get hit. In 2020, crypto ransom quadrupled over the previous year, and experts say 2 things are fueling the trend. First, the increasing number of people working remotely during the pandemic has made IT systems more vulnerable. And second, the difficulty in tracing certain cryptocurrency payments. We'll talk to our guests later in the show about what can be done to curb this newest form of cybercrime. But first, Donald Cameron has more on the growing trend of electronic extortion.
It's robbery on the information superhighway. Hackers are breaking into company computer systems, stealing corporate data or blocking access to it, and then demanding millions of dollars to return it. Ransomware attacks have long existed in the shadows, but in 2021 they've become far more frequent and more sophisticated. It might have once been science fiction, but hackers are now able to sabotage the infrastructure of major American cities. In February, a water treatment plant in Florida was hacked, briefly raising sodium hydroxide in drinking water to lethal levels. In March, a massive American insurance company paid $40 million to regain access to their data after being crippled for 2 weeks. In April, the NBA team, the Houston Rockets, reportedly had 500 gigabytes of data stolen, which included player contracts and privacy agreements. On the 1st of May, hackers downed a hospital system in San Diego, stealing the medical data of 150,000 patients and disrupting vital health services for almost a month. That same week, a hack on America's largest fuel pipeline disrupted the gas supply to the East Coast, raising petrol prices and disrupting airline operations. The next day, the Colonial Pipeline CEO paid $4.5 million to the attackers. The FBI was only able to recover about half of it. And in June, the world's largest supplier of beef was knocked offline, halting cattle slaughter at all US plants. The company paid $11 million to the hackers who breached their systems. Unsurprisingly, the US government is calling ransomware a rising national security threat, and Congress is desperately trying to understand how these attacks keep happening.
I made the decision to pay. It was the hardest decision I've made in my 39 years in the energy industry. I believe with all my heart it was the right choice to make.
Countries typically don't pay ransoms, but there's nothing stopping private companies from doing so. Lawmakers are putting pressure on corporations to do more to protect critical networks.
Did you have a plan for cybersecurity response that included guidance about ransomware?
Senator, specifically, no discussion about ransom and action to ransom.
I am concerned that it doesn't seem to have been a formal factor in your analysis of how much to strengthen your systems.
The US believes most ransomware attacks are being launched from Russia or former Soviet states, where authorities are either complicit or knowingly turning a blind eye. So, when Biden met Putin face-to-face for the first time as US president in Geneva last week, he laid out demands that the Kremlin crack down on ransomware gangs operating on Russian soil.
Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activities on their territory. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list.
That list of 16 critical infrastructure sectors are industries considered so vital that their incapacitation would debilitate the United States. But more than a quarter of them have already been hit. Putin has denied Russia played a role in any of the recent attacks, but Biden hinted at retaliation if they didn't stop.
And if in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond.
Putin, for his part, says he wants to cooperate with the US on fighting cybercrime globally.
Наши оценки расходятся, но, на мой взгляд, все-таки с обеих сторон было продемонстрировано желание понять друг друга и искать пути к сближению позиций.
Seeing eye to eye might be easier said than done when neither side fully trusts the other. One way or another, the US seems determined to tackle ransomware. But in trying to stop a threat they can't see coming, carried out by anonymous groups from unknown locations, they certainly have their work cut out. The vulnerabilities may be virtual, but the real-world repercussions can reap millions of victims. Donald Cameron, The Newsmakers.
Well, for more on ransomware attacks and some of the geopolitics behind them, I'm joined from Moscow by Andrei Fedorov. He is a former Russian deputy foreign minister and a current member of President Putin's advisory team. From Arlington, Virginia is former CIA officer and author John Kiriakou. And from Washington, Bob Sullivan, journalist and cybercrime expert who authors the blog The Red Tape Chronicles. Thanks all so much for being with us. Bob, let me start with you. First, I want to determine how much of this is actually about the illegal industry of hacking for profit versus attacking for geopolitical gain, i.e., undermining and compromising an adversary nation. What's the proportion at play here?
Well, it's a complicated question, and I want to start off by saying I'm a technology journalist, not a geopolitical journalist. But I think the important thing to know here is in the world of computer hacking, there is this murky gray area, which makes it very, very hard to not only attribute the source of attacks, to know who is actually committing these hacking attempts, but also to understand who they're working for and what they're working for. There are military-based attacks. There are computer hackers who are actually soldiers who are doing things under orders from a leader, from a world leader. And then there are these crimeware gangs who are doing things with perhaps the tacit permission of the land that they live in. And that's usually the accusation that we hear about these ransomware gangs that are based in Russia. And in fact, whether they're all physically in Russia at the time of the attacks, one of the reasons that we think that they're connected to Eastern Bloc nations is because the programs are literally designed not to attack Russian language computers. So as far as the proportion of what's the goal here, I think the people who are behind the keyboard want money, like they always do. But whether or not they're actually acting out and achieving some kind of geopolitical gain or just being difficult and making the world harder for the West, I think that's a question for the geopolitical experts here.
Okay, then let's turn to Andrei. Andrei, you'll remember in a 2016 interview with a U.S. network, President Putin was asked why Russia wasn't arresting suspected hackers, those, for example, who interfered in the U.S. election, allegedly. He said if they break, or if they did not break Russian law, there's nothing to prosecute them for in Russia. Let me ask you, is that an admission that he recognizes they broke laws elsewhere, but it's not Russia's problem, and therefore he can take the benefit of that?
First of all, I would like to say that everyone here in Moscow is now understanding the growing importance of cyber wars, because in the current situation, cyber attacks means a much more effective weapon than a nuclear weapon. You have no borders, you have no faces of enemy, but system is working. The question is the following, that in Russia, there is division, a kind of division of hacker groups. I know some of them. Some of hacker groups are really oriented on banks, on huge companies, asking for money, blocking the activity of these companies. But of course, today, what we call in Russia technological interference is an element of geopolitical strategy,
Right.
because it gives a possibility to influence. It gives a possibility to influence, and the problem is that, from Western point of view, that hackers are working rather freely. Formally, there are
Right.
absolutely no any hacker group in Russia which is linked to the government.
Okay, that's interesting.
But
Because
also,
even if what you're saying is true,
Yeah,
even if you're
but,
saying they're not linked to the Kremlin at all, that is definitely not what the perception is abroad and what other governments are saying. And Russia is now saying that it wants to cooperate to prevent attacks, but you know they're going to need
Yeah.
trust to get that cooperation and convince people that none of this is being done deliberately on behalf of the Kremlin, or at least that the Kremlin is turning a blind eye to it. So what is the plan then for Russia to go about gaining that trust and convince the world that it's on the right side?
As I said to you, the problem is that the government is trying to separate itself from any cyber activities against Western countries. But one of the top persons once told me that we should not stop hacking, because sometimes hacking is in the national interest. The problem is today that in Russia there is no clear definition of the areas which are possible to attack or which are impossible to attack or obligatory to refrain from any attacks. And by the way, the fact that President Biden gave the list to Mr. Putin, it's maybe a good signal that now we can try to fix certain areas, untouchable areas, on the both sides. And
Okay.
the other thing which I would like to stress, that many of our hackers, they are not working directly from the territory of Russia. They are using different backdoors like China, like North Korea, etc., etc. So it's very hard anyway to identify 100% that they're Russian hackers.
Okay, so there are other state actors involved, is what you're saying. Let me turn to John Kiriakou, because you've said repeatedly that it's actually just critical that we all improve our cybersecurity. But hackers are constantly also improving their techniques. So
Yes.
how can the good guys even stay ahead? And if not, if they can't technologically, what else can discourage these hackers, if that's possible?
I think, honestly, the only thing that can discourage hackers is prosecution. And I think that's not in the near term offing. You know, this is something that the U.S. government, frankly, doesn't spend enough time defending. We have NSA, we have CIA, we have DARPA, we have any number of other technology-oriented three-letter agencies that develop these hacking defenses, but then don't share those defenses with private corporations. There's just no system by which they have ever done that. So you're right. Hackers are getting better. Defenses are getting better. They're constantly one-upping each other. But that information has to flow more freely from government to private industry here in the United States. It's the only way that companies can protect themselves.
Right. So when you hear Andrei say, from the Russian perspective, there really is no connection with the Kremlin, and then you hear the U.S. say, we hold Russia entirely responsible for the hacking that's, interfered in our elections, as well as the criminal activity that ransomware attacks have been the source of. How do you go about trying to combat it if there is geopolitical intent behind these technologically criminal attacks that are also hitting companies?
Well, it may sound a little bit soft, but this is one of those areas where the United States and Russia really could cooperate. We've talked really for decades about enhanced and increased cooperation between the governments of Russia and the United States on counterterrorism, counterproliferation, human trafficking, things where there's really no downside, counter-narcotics. Well, this international hacking is another thing that we could conceivably cooperate on. Now, the United States, if you listen to the news reports and to the official word coming from government whenever there's a hack, they often say, or almost always say, that the hackers are connected to the Russian government. What exactly does that mean? It's never really been explained. Are they Russian government hackers? They're not saying that. If they are, then lay out the evidence. If they're not, then let's talk to the Russian government about some sort of legal and technical cooperation.
Okay, fair enough. Let me come back to Bob for a second. Bob, I actually want to ask you specifically before we, the clock is always running against us, and we need to talk about the Colonial Pipeline and the ransom that was actually paid and then partly confiscated. Let me ask you, if that case itself, because it was one of the best known, highest publicity cases, is it an anomaly that the FBI was able to recover that Bitcoin payment? And if not, does it clearly say that if you attack for profit, you will get caught?
Well, I think the elephant in the room with ransomware is the rise of cryptocurrencies, and specifically Bitcoin. I've been writing about ransomware since 2005. And between 2005 and 2015, ransomware gangs were successful when they lowered their demands to something that was very, very small, and they attacked small entities. All of a sudden, in 2013, with the rise of CryptoLocker, was the first ransomware that used Bitcoin, there was this sudden surge. And right now, it's so much easier for criminals to assess these large million-dollar ransom demands on companies and to get payment anonymously. Well, this pipeline attack could be a watershed moment because of all the agencies that were involved and the fact that they were able to claw back some of the money. That does put on notice these gangs that it might not be as easy to get money going forward. And in the end, you stop the cash flow, you're going to stop the attack. So that's really where I think a lot of energy should be focused right now.
Fair enough. I got to ask you, Bob, while I have you, I mean, how bad could this really get, given how, dependent we have all become on the web, on the cloud, on computers that are just too vulnerable to ransomware attacks? At this point, do we have any alternative? And I mean, is it actually as serious that, for many of us, our life savings could actually be at risk, since so much of our money is virtual? And I don't mean in cryptocurrencies necessarily, I mean at our own banks.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be worried about money. I'm more worried about food and fuel and electricity, because we had in the States, we had people who couldn't get gas because of this ransomware attack. And that made this very, very vague, ethereal notion about hacking that we've had forever very tangible for regular people. The food supply could be at risk. We all live this just-in-time life now. And as a result, any kind of disruption like this can have really, really serious immediate life impacts.
And are we also just quickly looking at scenarios in the future where satellites even might get hacked, shutting down crucial communications and infrastructure really for
GPS devices.
Yeah. How far off is that?
Yeah. We rely on all of these things immensely. I mean, how do you feel when you lose your smartphone for an hour?
Yeah.
And then think about what would happen if we lost access to our technology. And that's why these discussions of cyber war are so delicate, because the West has so much to lose if there were really some kind of a serious attack on cyber infrastructure.
Should we be looking at alternatives, Bob?
Well, we all move too far, too fast, too quickly, and we don't plan for backups and backups for our backups. And this is part of our modern life situation. We expect everything right away. I used to cover hurricane disasters, and my life policy is my gas tank is always full, because I realize how quickly in a natural disaster the gas pipeline and the gas infrastructure can collapse. I recommend that to anyone, and I think we should all live as if there's a hurricane around the corner, but it's virtual now.
It's funny, I think there's a fine line between thinking responsibly and then thinking paranoid, actually, when you look at all the things that we might be vulnerable, all these attacks that could hit us. Bob, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to go back to Andrei for a second, because we were also mixing in the geopolitical angle. Andrei, you're saying Russia as a state is not responsible for the hacking that we've seen, that the United States oftentimes does clearly blame Russia for. So tell us a little bit more about where Russia sees the more dangerous hackers, these other non-state actors that you talked about, and how the danger might actually be in other countries, including Iran, North Korea, or China.
Personally, I would like to say that the best hackers, which I personally know, are from North Korea. They are fantastic hackers. I've seen it myself in North Korea many times, how they're working. They are fantastic. Russian hackers are very good. And what is more important maybe to understand, which is not understood in the West, we have so-called number of so-called patriotic hackers group. The hackers group which are attacking some entities in Western Europe or in the United States just for fun, just for patriotic mood, to show how Russia is strong, how such people are capable to do, etc., etc. They don't want money. They want just to show that they're capable to break down any code, any access. They can get any access to anything.
Right.
And this is true. This is true. And such kind of groups are very flexible. They're very flexible. They are not. They don't have the planned list of targets. They can change the objects very quickly, depending on the political situation, geopolitical situation.
That's frightening. Let me push you, Andrei, on North Korea for a second. What exactly do hackers there want?
North Korean hackers, of course, part of North Korean hackers, they are oriented on money and breaking bank accounts, some transactions, etc., etc. But part of them, of course, are dealing with geopolitical things, with the Republic of Korea, with South Korea, with the United States. And I would like to say that I was very much surprised when number of years I was in Pyongyang. I'm visiting this country nearly every year. I've seen the top US computers for training of a younger generation of hackers. Absolutely top US computers.
Okay.
So that's why these people are capable to work.
Yeah. John, we're down to our last few minutes. Let me get back to you. I mean, it's just amazing, to hear how broad these hacking efforts are, because, the United States usually focuses on Russian efforts, but as Andrei was saying, there are real issues in various countries that see the U.S. in particular as an adversary. And I mean, we also laugh when we hear, there are guys in their parents' basements orchestrating a lot of this. But in Russia, it actually is true. Soviet education and its legacy means that there is an excess of highly trained people in math and technology without a lot of job options and a serious sense of patriotism, as Andrei was saying. So, I mean, to what extent does this criminal industry now cater to those people?
I think you've hit the nail on the head right there. And that's the challenge that the United States faces. This has been sort of an existential threat until recently, the last 5-6 years. The North Koreans allegedly hacked a major Hollywood film studio and crippled it, essentially. We're worried about our electrical grids. We're worried about our oil pipelines. We're worried about our food to market pipelines. I mean, all of these different things could be hacked. And here in the United States, we haven't even yet made a policy decision as to whether or not this is an act of war, and if it is, how we respond to it. Right. So there's a... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because it's right now, it's such bad publicity for any company that's hit. It makes consumers very nervous. So victims are obviously reluctant to announce that they've been hacked. So, I mean, how much hacking is actually happening that we don't even know about?
I think there's hacking all the time. In fact, I think that's why it was so newsworthy over the last couple of weeks when the FBI was able to recover half of the Bitcoin that went to the pipeline hackers. So I think this is something that happens constantly that we're just not informed of.
Is cryptocurrency going to be the next focus, do you think, then, of the FBI?
Yes, I think Bob Sullivan. Sure, I think Bob Sullivan's exactly right. This really is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Cryptocurrency, I think governments are so worried about cryptocurrency that the next step is that they're going to have to try to regulate it. Otherwise, hacking is going to worsen as a problem, not to mention money laundering and illegal hiding of money based on cryptocurrency. I think this is going to be a big problem.
And Bob, just very quickly, I mean, do you think cracking down on cryptocurrency might actually prevent further ransomware attacks? Or will they just find another way?
Well, let's not overstate the influence. There's this thing called business email compromise, which entirely uses wire fraud as its tool for moving money around. So there are other ways to move money. However, there is no coincidence between the rise of cryptocurrency and the rise of ransomware. So that's the first place to start, to at least get a handle on the problem.
Okay, Bob Sullivan, I will let you have the last word, because very unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. It was such an insightful conversation. I'd really like to thank Andrei Fedorov, John Kiriakou, and Bob Sullivan so much for joining me, and to our viewers as well, of course, for being with us. We'll see you next time.